as examples, he's a fellow of the Society of Labor Economics. He's a past president of the Midwest Econometric Economic Association. He won a Quantrell Award for excellence in undergraduate teaching. He was the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Labor Economics, the editor of the Political Economy, and was an editor for our own Journal of Human Resources. Broad topics within his research agenda would include the economics of education, progression of careers over the life cycle, racial wage gaps, and today's topic, the economics of crime. Derek has spent all of his career at Chicago, other than a 3-year period, and from 1998 to 2001. We were very fortunate to have him here as a colleague in Wisconsin, but then he went back to Hyde Park. This is nice for me. I first met Derek in 1991 when I was a graduate student, and he was an assistant professor. And from the beginning, he was always a really impressive person that just lives and breathes economics. He has a really broad knowledge of economics across many fields, as well as real depth in the areas that he worked in. But at the same time, this living and breathing economics was a very common feature in faculty at Chicago at the time. What was less a common feature in the faculty at the time is that Derek always had time for me and for the other graduate students to talk, and has had time ever since. So it's a real honor to call him a friend, and a real honor to introduce him today to talk about the impacts of parole supervision.
It's great to be here. In the spring of 2001, the economics department here nominated me for a research prize that was going to give me extra money. It was a divisional thing. They gave it to Mitch Denier, who was a ethnographer in sociology. And right after I found out Mitch got it instead of me, I got this offer from Chicago. And then a few years later, Mitch left and went to Princeton. And I've often wondered, you know, what if I had won the prize instead of the ethnographer? But I really enjoyed my time in Madison. I've been very thankful for the many times that people have welcomed me back to visit and give papers. And I hope that today you'll feel that it was another good decision to have me back. This is a paper called The Impacts of Parole Supervision. It is joint with Luke Brinkman, who just got his PhD from Wash U in St. Louis. Andrew Jordan, who is a constant co-author now and a former PhD student at University of Chicago. And here we go. Right when the pandemic started, I got a call from Bruce Western, who's a sociologist at the university, at Columbia University, although I think he's running Russell Sage now. He wanted me to serve on a National Academy of Sciences panel to study reducing racial disparities in criminal justice outcomes. And he said, you know, you'll be working with Steve Raphael and Rob Sampson and these other, you know, empirical social scientists. I said, sure. I've started to work on crime. I want to learn more. I showed up at the first meeting, and half the panel were critical scholars from law schools and departments like that. And one of the things that I learned early on in doing research was I learned that there was this growing literature that apparently there was a big problem with people leaving parole and probation, going back to prison with not a lot of evidence that they had actually committed a crime. And that this seemed to be low-hanging fruit, given that the ratio of in terms of representation in the population, blacks were, 5, 6 times more likely to be on parole or probation than whites. If you had a policy that was very punitive and wasn't doing any good in terms of public safety, if you just got rid of that, you would get rid of a big disparate impact. I was told by the critical scholar part of the community or the committee that we weren't allowed to talk about that or make that a focus, because to do that would legitimize the idea that we needed prisons in the first place. And so any kind of concrete reform about how you ran prisons was off limits in the initial parts of the discussion. And so in many ways, this paper and a paper that came out in the Russell Sage Foundation Journal that Andy and Steve Raphael and I put out last fall, this is what I wanted to do on that committee, and they wouldn't let me because this was too quantitative and I was being too marginal. I wasn't willing to talk about getting rid of all prisons. So with that introduction, it is the case that we have about 469,000 prison admissions each year. And in Illinois, 1 out of 4 of those is for a technical violation of parole. And 8.9% of the prison population at any one point in time in Illinois is sitting there because they broke a rule, not necessarily because they committed a crime. And so the Lofstrom paper from California is about parole. This more recent but unpublished paper from North Carolina is not about a reform of parole, but about actually introducing parole for a bunch of people that didn't have it before. The Rose paper is about probation in North Carolina. The first two are, we're going to change the rules about whether or not you can send someone to prison just for breaking a rule versus a crime. The third paper is about putting people at exposure for going back to prison for breaking a rule because now you put them under active supervision. All 3 papers point you in the direction of saying introducing the supervision and introducing the possibility to send people back to prison for breaking rules leads to growth in the prison system with questionable gains in terms of public safety. However, none of these papers that deal with parole, Rose's paper that deal with probation is different, but none of the previous papers with parole had what modern economists call a research design, where you had a similar control group, treatment group, that are going through treatment by the law, and then there's a sharp change in the law, and one group keeps getting the old treatment, and the other group gets something brand new in terms of how the law affects them. And so what I've got here, very sharp law, satisfies that research design criterion. And so what I can show you is, in this very clean natural experiment context, you get the answer that people had, in a less convincing way got before, and it's actually bigger in some sense than you might have expected from the previous literature, and you can't kill it regardless of how you try, okay? And the results on no changes in public safety are actually more compelling and kind of more solid zeros than I ever imagined that they would be. All right, so that's what we're doing here. The act in question was the Illinois Safety Act. You guys have all heard about this on the news because it got a lot of press for getting rid of cash bail in Illinois. And it was all over the national news for a long time. Buried in the middle of this was a reform to parole. The most important thing for understanding what's going on here is every class, every crime in Illinois has a class. The class not only determines the sentencing range, but determines how long you have to serve on mandatory supervision once you get out. And there's no parole board that can change that. It's just fixed by law. And so what we're going to have is we're going to have a situation that before the reform, class 1 and class 2 got 2 years, class 3 and 4 got 1 year. When the reform came in, a big group of class 1 now got 1 year, and then the law said you could do whatever you wanted between 0 and 1 year with the class 3 and 4. What actually happened was the Prisoner Review Board was giving everybody 1 year, okay? So when the reform first starts, they're getting 1 year and they're getting 1 year, because even though the initial reform gave this discretion, it was never used. Then there was an amendment. And so what the amendment did was says these guys have 1, these guys have 6 months. And that's what we're going to use. We've got 6 months where both were getting 1 year, and then we've got 6 months where the people leaving prison, one group's getting 6 months, the other group's still getting 1 year. So that's the design. Okay? This is the Derek Neal seminar presentation style. I say everything and then hit the button and you see it all on the screen. But I was told I only have 40 minutes, so I'm going faster. We're going to have 3 outcomes. We're going to look at total returns to prison. We're going to look at technical revocations. You went back to prison, but there's no evidence of a crime. You broke a rule. And by the way, there's a lot of rules you can break in Illinois. The standard is 14, but they can add additional ones depending on what your parole officer says. This is like, you can't live in a home with a felon. You can't associate with gang members. You can't move addresses without permission. You can't leave the county without telling your parole officer, those types of things. And we're also going to look at returns that are associated with new crimes. There's 5 different estimators in the first part of the paper. I'm going to mainly show you the difference in difference results. And here are the results, the preview. If we look at 15 months from the time you leave prison, this reform reduced the percentage of people who return to prison for any reason by 11 percentage points on a baseline of 23%. So it's a 46% reduction in the probability that someone released from prison returns to prison within 15 months. All of that, as a first order approximation, is driven by a reduction in technical revocations. It's hard to find any evidence that this had a statistically significant effect on returns associated with new crimes. And the magnitudes of the new crime effects at 15 months are very small. So you might ask yourself, this doesn't make any sense. If we quit sending people back to prison for breaking the rules, and prison did nothing, and supervision did nothing to the likelihood that you committed a crime, we should have had an increase in crime rates just from having fewer people that were incapacitated and locked up. The answer to the puzzle that I'll show you at the end is that we have some evidence that active supervision actually makes people more likely to be arrested. And it's not a monitoring effect, because we'll show you when we get to the Cook County results, it's the local police that are doing the arresting. Okay, and so that small effect on the arrest rate offsets the incapacitation effect, and you get big zeros on the public safety effect. Okay, we're going to look at a small subsample to flesh out what I just told you, because we're going to have the court records. We're going to have the prison records and the court records for 1,784 people who were released to Cook County. At the very end, I'm going to show you stuff from a competing risk model. When you run regressions, you can't really have an estimate of how these things interact, right? Because the likelihood that you get brought back to prison for a new crime affects whether you're exposed to the risk of getting brought back to prison for a technical revocation and vice versa. So the fact that one determines the at-risk status for the other means that if you want to simulate the results of changing the policy again, you can't do it with the regression results. You have to have a model. At Wisconsin, everybody's going to be happy with that statement. And so I'll show you a little bit of simulation evidence at the end. Okay, and we'll say, what if instead of going to 6, they'd gone to 3? All right? All right, so this is the research strategy. I've said all of this. To remind you, the treatment sample is class 3 and 4. The treatment date is the 6th of December, 2022. If you were released in the 6 months before that, it didn't matter where you were class 3 or class 4, you got 1 year of supervision. If you're released after that and you're still class 1 or 2 and you were sentenced at the right date, you get a year still. If you're class 3 or 4, you get 6 months. Okay? Now, to make referees happy, I also said, well, what if you want the treatment control to be closer together, and so you only do the 2 and 3? You have to kind of look close and realize that changed a little bit, but it's very similar results. One caveat is if you were released between 12/6/22 and the end of the year, I throw you out. And the reason I throw you out is that the law made it very clear this is supposed to go effect today. The law was passed on December, and it was supposed to go effect today. The prison system did not change what they were doing until the first of the year. And if you go through all of the records that exist, it's really unclear when they told these guys, oh, by the way, you only get 6 months. I know from a bunch of emails with the people that work for the prison system that they were running around in June of the next year trying to change the records. We can't find out when in the world they told the people that, oh, you're done. Okay, and so we don't know what the treatment status is for that group, so we threw them out. All right? Now, this is just a summary of what I just said. We got this all, if people want to do research on this, all the main data for this is on the web. The Illinois Department of Corrections, every 3 months, they post snapshot of who are the people on supervision release, the supervised post-release, mandatory supervised release, which is their parole system, who are the people in prison at a point in time. And every 6 months, they have a list of all the people in the last year who were either admitted or who exited. And so you can spend a long time cleaning. There's only about 2% of the records that have typos and mistakes. But when you start with 2 million records, it's still a lot of cleaning. And you can put together histories of people in the prison system, and we're going to use those histories to create control so that we can show that there's not any difference that's important in terms of the characteristics of the treatment control group, and what there is we can control for. All right? We can also, with some effort, code up these events once people release. Did you return to prison? If you did, was it a technical or was it a new crime? We can't do as well as we would like to on the technical versus the new crime and just the prison data, in part because the prison system doesn't record things well. the first time you come back, they are very prone, sometimes even when it's a new crime, to code you as a technical revocation and then change it later in some way. It's very hard to find them all. We got the court data because we thought maybe we missed a few. But it turns out, even when we get the court data, we're not seeing any evidence that we missed the updates. All right. This is details on the coding concern, but Anant's told me to finish and take questions. So here is the whole paper. You can get the whole paper in the descriptive statistics. Okay? So let's look at 15 months, any return to prison. Okay? In the pre-period for the control group, we have 0.221. In the post-period for the control group, we have 0.251. So the return to prison rate went up by 3 percentage points in the control group. May have been a secular trend, whatever. But that's going to be how we're measuring the trend. In the treatment group, it fell from 0.243 to 0.173. That's a fall of 6%. 6 plus 3 is 9. Over and over again, you're going to see treatment effects that are about 9 to 10 percentage points on return to prison. That's driven by the fact that when you do this for technical revocations, this drops by over 7 percentage points. When you go pre-treat to post-treat, in fact, it drops by over 8 percentage points. This went up by 3.2. So you get, it's everything is right here in the descriptive statistics. If you do a difference in difference on the cell means, you get that there was a 9 to 10 percentage point reduction in returns to prison due to technical revocations among treatment control, and that created about a 9 to 10 percentage point change in the total returns to prison. And there's really nothing on new crimes. Everything else in this paper is just painting by the numbers that modern social science is required to paint by. All right? There's not much difference between the characteristics of the treatment and control, other than the fact that the treatment group is a little less black. Okay? So, here are the controls. We have race, we have number of past prison admissions, number of past prison admissions for Class X, Class 1, and Class 2, number of prior times that you violated MSR when you were released from prison. The indicator for your last sentence was a long sentence. The indicator for the age at when you were released. For all the grad students in the room, what's the most important set of controls in this analysis? You know. Chris? Age. The omitted category is 18 and 19-year-olds. And the set of coefficients just look like a ski slope. You're just going down. The older you get, the better you behave on every dimension. And the 18 and 19-year-olds are a huge problem. And so that's, and the T statistics on that gradient, you know, they're as big as you want them to be. Okay? So the age categories are very important. The crime categories don't change anything in the results. A referee told us after we said, why didn't you include, you know, dummies for not just the class, but the category? Was it a violent crime, a property crime, a drug crime? So I went, why didn't we do that? And so we reran the whole thing, putting in those categories. The reason we didn't do it is sometimes the prison and the courts disagree about the category, where they always pretty much agree on the class. So anyway, we put the categories in, and it was amazing. I spent 5 minutes trying to make sure that Luke did it right, because I, with my 62-year-old eyes in the beginning of a cataract, I couldn't tell the difference. And so if you added the categories, visually, you can't tell the difference in the results I'm going to show you. This is the difference in difference regression equation that all the grad students here should have seen until you're sick of it over the last several years of going to empirical micro talks. This is the pre-trans test that is part of the liturgy, that we have to do pre-trans tests before we give results in these talks. And I will brag on my p-value being 0.987, 0.778, 0.889, okay? So I don't want to hear any mishigas about pre-trends. This is the paper right here, the next 2 slides. You wouldn't expect anything to show up really before 6 months, right? Because both the treatment and control group in the post and pre are getting at least 6 months. So it's only after 6 months that they start to diverge. You see something at 6 months, and we see this in the competing risk model too. I think there's an anticipation effect. And you know, the dynamics people in the room can tell me whether they agree with this logic. Once you only have a month left to go, if we think there are any psychic costs of behaving yourself, it's going to be easier to behave for 1 month when you know that if I just make it 1 more month, I'm not under supervision anymore. So you see a little bit show up in the last month, and then you just see things start to grow. And by the time that you get to 15 months, this is 10.9. This is just a little bit bigger than the between 9 and 10 that I showed you in the descriptive statistics. All right? Now, what causes this result? Changes in technical revocations. There's nothing in terms of changes in returns to prison associated with a new crime. All right? There's no clock in this room. Okay, I got 12 minutes according to my phone. All right, so this is an interesting thing. There's really no difference by race in terms of the impact of treatment. There are some baseline differences by race. African Americans in the competing risk model, everything else constant, are more likely to be dragged back for a revocation. Non-whites are more likely to be dragged back for a new crime. But if you look at an aggregate model, we didn't have enough data to really estimate a separate competing risk model by race. But if you look at the aggregate effects, there's no change in the total treatment effect by race. And so that's why you're not seeing race effects here. Okay? I'm also going to show you IV results. And the reason is, well, you want to make clear, what's the difference in difference doing? The difference in difference is saying, what's the effect of going from a regime where the default went from 6 to 12? Almost everyone, but not everyone, actually got 6 or 12, because you can be delayed in terms of when you are released because you're trying to secure housing and you get credit for that. There's some people that sit in the county jail so long, they get their prison sentence, they've covered their whole prison sentence and part of their parole. And so, but those are a small number. So, but if you want to have a sentence that says, what is the effect of moving from exactly 6 months to 12 months in terms of your assigned term of supervision, you have to do the IV. And you also have to flip things because now we're increasing it. So everything you saw before that was a decrease now is going to be an increase. And what happens when you do this is you get the same numbers in absolute value or just about a half a percentage point bigger. Okay? So that's that. Now, because we were worried that maybe we had some people that were technical revocations, they were really new crimes, and the prison system didn't update their records, we matched a little more than 1,800 people who were released to Cook County, we matched them to the Cook County court records. So we could see both before and after their whole history in the court. And what we did was we created this table. So the rows are the most significant event we found post-release for you in the court records. And so there can be no court case, there can be a misdemeanor case, there can be a felony with no conviction, there can be a felony where you were convicted, but they didn't send you back to prison for some reason, even though you were on parole, and there can be a felony where you were convicted and went back to prison, and these were the ones that we were really interested in, right? We wanted to know about the people who somehow got convicted of a felony, but got probation. There are 28 of these out of that sample. We have, in full disclosure, we don't have any way of knowing how many there were in counties outside Cook County. So the one hole in what I'm showing you is that we may have missed some people that got felony convictions and probation in Peoria, okay? But this is a small sample, and what we've done, and by the way, you might think you guys made a mistake because you've got people who went to prison for a new crime, even though we've got no record of the court case. Well, you got to remember there's 9 million people in the Chicagoland area. Only 5 million live in Cook County. There's a very densely populated counties that surround Cook. So if you were arrested in Will or DuPage or whatever and got sent back to prison, you would be in this cell, okay? So what we're going to do is we're going to say, if you're in this row, or if you're in this column, or if you're in this column or this row, you had a new crime, okay? And so now we're going to make that measure any new crime, and we're going to remind you that there's this new crime admission measure that's completely from the IDOC data, and we're going to say, what if we use just the Cook County data? What would it look like? Well, if you remember the last graph, it stopped about here at like 1 percentage point. This changed, but this is basically the same picture you saw before. But now, if you do any new crime, this is a smaller sample, the standard errors are bigger. This is actually below, okay? And so when we actually have the court records and we say, if we find any evidence in the court or prison that you were convicted of a felony, we call it a new crime. Now you might say, well, what about the people that were arrested for a felony and then they got sent back to prison on a technical revocation because they did other things wrong, while they're waiting for their court case to resolve, and the state's attorney said, forget it, he already went back to prison, we weren't going to be able to send him for a long time anyway. So you might worry about that. So now we can do any new charge, and we'll add the people that had a felony charge but weren't convicted. Still get the same result. You might say, what about misdemeanors? Okay? In the control sample, the treatment sample, pre and post, you get between 11 and 12% of the people got misdemeanors charges. Okay? And you can't, in Cook County, you can't tell who's convicted, not convicted of the misdemeanor, because most of it is resolved by, are you willing to go to our counseling program? If you are, then we won't count it as a conviction. Well, is that a conviction or not? You just agreed to give up, 100 hours of your time to not, and so, all right. So here we go. For the grad students afterwards, there'll be a quiz on this likelihood function. So what we did was we estimated a competing risk model where there's a risk of going back for a technical revocation and there's a risk of going back for a new crime. They compete. Unobserved heterogeneity, we couldn't find any evidence that it helps or matters here. So conditional on all those X's, these are independent risk. And here are the results. This is, and we're doing it for the class 3 and 4 population. We're simulating based on the parameters. The green line is the 12 months, which was pre. The red line is post, which is the treatment, the treatment people got 6 months in the post period. And then what if it was 3 months? Okay, and so this is, the failure event is a prison admission, any prison admission. And what we see is we go from about, let me give you the exact numbers here. Okay, I wrote them out on a piece of paper and lost them at Catherine's talk, it looks like. Anyway, this is like 24.6, I believe it was. And this is less than 0.1. Okay? And these things, if you look at them, they're not that different than what was implied by the difference in difference analysis when you look at the difference between red and green. Okay? Now, technical revocations, I remember this one. This is 7, this is 2.5, this is just a little more than 15. Okay? This is the key to the last part. The people going back to prison for a technical revocation, when you go from 12 to 6, you cut it by more than half. When you go from 6 to 3, you cut it by more than half. So if we're going to do cost-benefit analysis on this, and by the way, there's nothing on the crime, there's a little bit of an effect that having 3 months instead of 12 months lower the probability of going back for a crime. So if we're going to do cost-benefit analysis on this, a kind of lower bound is, say, suppose that we could cut the technical revocation rates in half by having the terms that people serve. 6 to 3 for the 3 to 4 people, 6 instead of 12 for the class 1 and class 2. And so that's what we do. And if you add in the cost of you save by firing some supervision agents and the cost that you save by closing one prison, because it works out almost exactly. We were able to find a prison that had almost exactly the number of people that we would not have in steady state in the prison. And if you do $15 an hour for the shadow price of time for the people who were avid to sit in prison, you get about $170 to $185 million in savings. You get no cost in terms of public safety. I did some back of the envelope calculations. If you did this nationwide and you just extrapolated, it's about $5.5 billion, which, I think between lunch and now we paid that in interest on the national debt, so maybe you're not impressed. When I started in the profession, $5.5 billion was a big number, but not so much anymore. And so here is the last slide. And here are the questions I think that this raises. Research question, if we eliminate MSR, what's the optimal design of service provision? One of the things that's true if you think about it as economists, The incentives are set up for the parole officers to do what they do. They don't get any rewards if somebody succeeds. They get shame and public condemnation in the papers if they miss dragging some dangerous guy back and he makes a mistake. Okay? And so, how would you change things? Well, you might do what they do. I'm on the board of a nonprofit. We run vocational training for ex-offenders, and we get paid by a performance contract. If they finish the class, we get a certain amount. If they pass the exam and get in the construction union, we get a bonus. If they get a job and keep the job for 6 months, we get a bigger bonus. And they do that with all kinds of services for released prisoners already. Why couldn't you replace parole with something like that, where the people that are supposed to help people reenter actually get paid for success? Or you might say, well, Derek, it's very hard to do mechanism design with service providers or with public employees. The optimal thing to do, based on what you showed us, is just to get rid of supervision. And then the last question is, based on this result, if you were going forward with either reform, would you want to do pilot studies in a few counties? Or would you want to just say, no, go big or go home, get rid of it statewide? Those are things for people to discuss. How late am I?
We're about on time.
All right. When he stood up, I thought I'd run way over.
We're going to open up for questions. We're going to open up for questions now, and Derek's agreed. We're going to be a broad set of questions, so you can complain about standard errors if you want, or you can have broad questions about policy that go way beyond the scope of the paper. So let me. Okay, I'll ask the first question then. So who would support parole? So given these results, who would support sending people back to prison for violating the rules?
So one of the most surprising things to me, from talking at great length several years back to the guy who's chief legal counsel or was in for the Prisoner Review Board, and watching the technical revocation hearings on closed circuit television. The people who run the system believe they're doing the Lord's work. They actually think that the best way to help someone reenter is to give them the 15 rules and to kind of treat it like a 12-step program. And if you follow our rules, it puts you on the path to success. And they actually believe stone cold that the people they're sending back on technical revocations are really the dangerous people. And so I think that the people who would not believe this are the people that get paid to run the current system. And the only academic that I've had push back against me on this is a sociologist named Bob Crutchfield, who's at the University of Washington. Before he was an academic, he was a parole officer. and so the people that do it actually believe that this system of not actually rewarding or punishing real criminal behavior, but focusing on the rules. And so I think there's a large group of people that work in the industry that say this is the way we've always done it, and we know it works. And I think that would be the big barrier to reform.
So they would have expected the rearrest rates for the 6-month people to be higher in the long run than.
And well, what they're going to yell, and the reason we got the court data, what they're going to yell is, a lot of those technical revocations were really crime. They were, we had the MSR officer get them because we knew that they were starting to get up to no good again. and it's labeled technical, but they were really criminals. Well, if that was true, it would have shown up in the court data, right? If you know, because that's the independent verification. The CPD and the sheriff's office didn't pick these guys up when you couldn't take them back on the revocation anymore. Yes.
I have kind of more of a political economy question on the cost-benefit analysis. You mentioned that there's conveniently just enough prisoners that are no longer in the prison in the steady state that you could close down a prison. Presumably, there's a state legislator or two in the Illinois House who would object to the prison in their district being closed because you'd lose a bunch of jobs in some downstate area where it's a reasonably big part of the economy. Is that
So it is Illinois. It is, these are unionized public workers. And, you know, we have a situation in the city of Chicago in the public schools where they spend in real dollars, you know, 50 to 100% more than they did 10 years ago and have like 100,000 fewer students. So that is a real concern. And I think what would probably happen is they would redirect, they wouldn't change the budget for the prison system, but they would redirect it to providing mental health services in a lot of prisons now that don't have mental health workers. And I've seen some studies that lead me to believe that I'm okay with that, because if you're paying a lot of money to lock people up that don't need to be there, you might not only be able to give better post-release services, but better in-house services for the people that have drug addiction and mental health problems. And that's a non-trivial part of the population.
cool? Thank you.
Other questions? All right. Well, thank you very much.